Thanks everyone for bearing with us. Let's try and sit maybe a little bit in range of each other because it's quite a long way around. I don't know. Just sit. Never mind. I think just take a seat and we'll use the mics and it'll be fine. Why don't we bring the panel to here where you started? Just so everyone knows, the event is being recorded. So just so you know, this will be recorded and used. I hope that's okay, but I want to make sure you know. Thanks. Good checking. So while you come in and get settled, I'll just start quickly with an overview of what we're doing here. The panel is effectively looking at false solutions and the role of agroecology as an alternative. And we're going to start by explaining what it is, what does that mean, false solution, and where we see it arising in the discussions on climate. We also have Million Bellet to talk a bit about what else we could be doing. For us, that's how we see agroecology. And then I'm hoping at the end to have a bit more discussion about where we see false solutions emerging in the climate talks, and then if we have time, where else in the UN we could be doing a little bit of triangulation, if you like, to bring more pressure to bear here and to make sure that food and agriculture issues are properly represented in the world of climate and environmental negotiations. So my name is Sophia Murphy. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And we're co-hosting this panel with CIDSE, with Vincent Daubé, who'll be the first speaker, who's the policy officer at CIDSE for agroecology and food sovereignty. Welcome, everyone, and I suggest we get started. Vincent, you have the floor.
Hello. Okay. Thank you very much for being here. So, as Sophia said, I'm Vincent Daubé. I'm working for CIDSE as the Agroecology and Food Sovereignty Officer. And so we have been working on climate and agriculture for a while, and we are questioning solutions that are provided in some of the spaces. So first of all, I just want to quickly give an overview of what's our approach of false solution and how we understand it. And I just first want to recall a bit the situation where we are here now. Some scientists are confirming that we are on the path for plus 3 degrees at the end of this century. So we are really in a state of urgency of finding solution and implementing good solution. We definitely need to stop the fossil fuel and to go to renewable energy. And I'm a bit concerned to see that at this COP we can see some countries making commitments about continuing fossil fuels. There is also the crisis on biodiversity. We need biodiversity in terms for climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and some solutions that are provided are really impacting biodiversity. So this is also an issue that we have to take into consideration when we are discussing climate. The climate situation, it's not just climate situation, it's also justice and social situation. We all know that the most impacted people are from the global south, while the global north is the responsible of the situation. So just to give you like a bit the analysis of the situation of the point of view of CIDSE. So we decided a few months ago to produce a new report on false solution. It's still ongoing. It will be published next year, in the beginning of next year, but we had discussion within ourselves to how do we define what is a false solution or a good or transformative solution. So we think of a series of criteria to be able to identify, if I can say, what is a false solution. So for us, a false solution, it's a solution that represents the interest of big company, fossil fuel company, agribusiness, industrial agriculture. They are the one promoting a full solution with some different concepts. For instance, there is a report that was published a few weeks ago from IPES Food concerning the understanding of what is nature-based solution, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, and we can see that nature-based solution or regenerative agriculture are easily taken by big companies as solution, but it's concept that is not really clear, and that's maybe the reason why they are taken up, while agroecology is more defined and understood within UN bodies, but agroecology question interest, question governance. So that might be a reason why we don't see so much support for this good solution. And by doing so, they keep the power as it is, they keep the system as it is, while we need to change that. There is also to define a full solution. Full solution for us are solutions that perpetuate the biodiversity loss and that don't really address the root cause of climate change. They often focus only on one aspect of the situation. For instance, I would say like planting trees that can maybe help for reforestation, but it's often monoculture. It will impact biodiversity and brings loss of biodiversity. It's for interest of company, and it's also impacting population and population rights. That's the other point that we are using as a criteria, is the impact of local communities and their fundamental rights. All those communities, they live on lands, they rely on their lands, they rely on their biodiversity. And when solutions such as big monoculture or big dam arrive, they often has to be moved away. So their rights are not respected, while also biodiversity is destroyed, and they rely on biodiversity to live. So that's why for us, that's kind of the big criteria that we are using to figure out what is a full solution and when we need to confront it. There is also linked to full solution, the way these full solutions are financed. Often they are relying on markets and carbon credit. We will discuss that today. While we think that it's more important to invest and not rely on markets to develop the solution, as markets keeps the richer, and it keeps the system as it is. And we know that the system as it is the reason why we are in this climate situation. So that's it for me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. I realize I sat down without checking how long we have the room, but I'm going to assume we can probably go till at least 1:15, but I'll try and affirm that in the meantime. So before I turn to the next two speakers, maybe just to throw in from our side, IATP also had a report on false solutions that we were aiming primarily at a US audience and at a lot of the foundation interest that is suddenly picking up on agriculture from the climate side without, I think, necessarily understanding the politics and dynamics of land and agriculture. And some of the questions that we put in, to ask around what is a false solution include who's paying for it, who's benefiting, who's getting the profit, who's bearing the risk, because our experience with the Clean Development Mechanism and some of these other systems has been that the risk is all on the farmer. And then is it addressing all dimensions of the crisis we're in, or is it trying to solve just one problem, like store carbon, versus thinking about broader causes of climate change and environmental distress? And is it actually cutting emissions? Because I think, as you'll hear, we actually see quite a lot of solutions involve increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So the next two speakers, first Shefali Sharma, who's my colleague, director of the European Office for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, who will be looking at false solutions, especially in the livestock sector. And then Kirtana Chandrasekhar from Friends of the Earth, International Coordinator for Food Sovereignty. I have the title right. Looking at the carbon markets, carbon offsets. Shefali, to you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for being so flexible and moving half the way across the whole center. We appreciate it. Yeah, so I want to talk about what are the biggest meat and dairy companies around the world doing in terms of the net zero framing. ITB's been looking at the big livestock corporations for at least about 10 years now, and over 10 years. And we produced a series of reports called, it's called the Emissions Impossible series, which looks at the climate footprint of the big meat and dairy processors. And our last report, Emissions Impossible Europe, actually looked at the European companies, companies that are global but headquartered in the EU, and what kind of strategies do they use to avoid actually cutting their own emissions, but claiming that they're meeting net zero. So there are 5 strategies that I want to outline. One is that they co-opt our narrative on agroecology and agroecological practices. They call it regenerative agriculture. And it basically entails within their supply chains, and I attended a very interesting session yesterday by soil carbon credit companies and what they're doing, and it was the most fascinating session, I have to say. But it does involve digitizing every single activity on farm within their supply chains, right? And then they claim that as them reducing their supply chain emissions. All the burden, as Sophia pointed out, goes to that farmer to give all that data to these companies every step of the way. Then there's also the issue of conflict of interest when we talk about this, which is called in the net zero lingo, it's called insetting. So Nestle has a proposal out there and it's talking about insetting, and it's basically offsetting, getting others to reduce their emissions but claiming credit for it within their supply chain. This is becoming very, very big, not just for livestock companies, but for all agribusinesses, this concept of insetting. They also use techno fixes, so tinkering around the edges of the industrial ag extractive system. This can be unproven feed additives. There's a lot of talk about methane inhibitors. There was a study that looked at 90 scientific studies looking at methane inhibitors, and basically the science is still out there. It's very, very costly. It's patented technology, and they're not sure how long that methane is inhibited in the guts of ruminants, right? That's what this whole methane inhibitor is supposed to do. It's supposed to, you're supposed to buy this patented additive from an agrochemical company, and you're supposed to, in the industrial ag chain of mass production, reduce methane from these. So it's not about changing how you produce livestock or grow livestock. It's about just seeing how you can reduce the impact a little bit. Then there's this whole issue on focus on the reduction of emissions per kilo of meat or a liter of dairy. It's called emissions intensity reduction. That's many of the companies, both dairy and meat companies, only have targets for emissions intensity reduction, often only for their operations. So not in their supply chains, but really how their plants operate, what kind of transport they use, et cetera, et cetera. And what this does is that it basically says, hey, I can just produce as much as I want. I can export as much as I want. But every unit that I export is just going to have slightly less emissions, so I should get credit for that. Another one is public incentives, usually, for what we call anaerobic digesters. So we're talking about massive scales here, right? The United States has livestock farms that could have upwards of 10,000 cattle. Imagine the amount of manure that is there. And increasingly, you see that in Brazil, it's increasing. It's increasing in Europe. So, and Brazil is starting to have lots of operations in Mozambique and other parts of Africa where you start to see these companies moving. So again, this is converting all of this manure into so-called biogas, which activists in the United States call factory farm gas. Because basically it's converting one problem into something else, slightly less, but it's basically incentivizing this very extractive system, right? Intensive factory farm way of raising animals creates nitrate pollution, it creates ammonia, air pollution, it creates land pollution. Local communities are inconvenienced. So it's all the feed grains that go into feeding into the system creates deforestation and land use change. But if you just capture that manure, not only do you get public subsidies to create these plants, but you also benefit the biogas, the gas industry. So in the United States, we've started to see projects between Chevron and Iowa pork farms, right? Facilities. Smithfield, which is one of the largest pork producers, its mothership is WH Group, which is a Chinese company. It's by far the biggest pork producer in the world. Is going to now start getting credits for renewable energy in North Carolina, and they're pushing for this gas to be renewable. In the EU, after the Ukraine war, we have the Repower EU program where they want to, 12-fold increase of gas, right? Biogas, biomethane. So what is that going to look like for livestock production in the EU? This is quite problematic from a systemic, planetary, boundary, holistic perspective of how we want livestock agriculture to be done. And then finally, there's this issue of impermanent soil and grassland carbon offsets sold on carbon markets. And I kid you not, I was on I listened to a panel yesterday where we had Mars sitting at the table. We had Indigo, which is a carbon credit aggregator. And we had Vera, which certifies these carbon credits. And the bottom line was, there was this debate about how right now, the soil carbon market is just 0.02% of the entire carbon market. And by 2023, they want to sequester 600 million tons of carbon. And for that to happen, they have to aggregate a large number of farmers to be able to get those credits. They said, yes, there are scientific and technical problems around impermanence, but we need to keep going. And then Mars was like, yes, and you know what? We want to do this with suppliers in our chain. We don't want our farmers to go to Microsoft. We want all those credits so that we can have insetting. So imagine this world in the next, 8 years where you want to explode these carbon credits. The science on soil carbon is completely the opposite, right? It is not permanent. Sorry, I know you're going to talk a lot about this, but the panel was so illuminating in terms of where they're going, the fights that are going to take place in terms of creating these credits between the tech industry, a big giant like Microsoft on the one hand, and then giants like Unilever and Mars who want this within their supply chains. So I'll stop there. I think I can give more examples, but there you go. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the false solutions that we see here happening at the COP. And the first thing I'm going to say is that for those of you who are at the Kick Big Polluters Out action this morning, you would have heard that there are 636 fossil fuel lobbyists at this COP, a 25% increase from the last COP. And that is not counting all the people that Shefali was just talking about, the industrial agriculture lobbyists. And they have spent the last 3 decades tanking any kind of progress that we can make in this space, but anywhere, on climate emissions reductions and climate justice. And the concepts of false solutions is the new climate denial. So this is their strategy for continuing their expansion plans, which they all are. None of the fossil fuel companies, none of the agribusiness companies are actually have any serious plans to change their business models. They all have expansion plans way into the future. And this is the way that they can justify their expansion plans and pretend that they are part of the solution. So that's the framing in which we have to see all the false solutions that we see. But it's not just corporations and agribusinesses. You also have the big polluting companies. So the US, which is responsible for 52% of historical emissions from Annex II countries, 22% of global historical emissions, cumulative emissions, which should be providing $40 billion of climate finance according to their fair shares, and have provided so far $8 billion, and have no plans to come to this COP for any more commitments on climate finance. But rather, John Kerry came yesterday and said he has developed a new voluntary carbon offset market, which is what he's bringing to this COP as his way of getting out of the commitments that the US has to be making on climate finance and on actual emissions reductions. And this is, of course, with regard to the trillions that are actually needed for developing countries to achieve their climate targets, which is absolutely not on the table. So we are leaving this COP with no money, no public money, no additional money. Anything that's coming is in the form of private sector money, carbon market money, or loans, conditional loans, the new structural adjustment. So what it's actually doing, the framework of carbon markets and these false solutions are what the US brought into the Paris Agreement to break the framework of common but differentiated responsibility that we should be operating under, which means that the historical polluting countries are the ones who are responsible for doing first and steep and drastic emissions reductions by 2030, and then followed by developing countries who need technological support, finance support, for them to be able to reach these countries. So carbon markets, which essentially what they do is allow big polluters, both corporations, but also big polluting countries, to not reduce emissions, but rather pay somebody in the global south to either plant a tree or take over their lands or grab forests, grab oceans, to supposedly reduce or avoid emissions on their behalf, is climate colonialism. It is actually pushing the responsibility of who should be doing emissions onto the people that have done the least to contribute to global emissions. It will not reduce emissions. Let us be absolutely clear that carbon offsets do not reduce emissions. What they do is mean that big polluters can expand and claim that there is somewhere, somebody additionally reducing emissions. So there are no absolute emissions reductions with carbon offsets. On the contrary, what we have found with all the research on the last clean development mechanism is that something like 17% of CDM projects have actual emissions reductions. That's absolutely outrageous. A recent paper that came out about renewable energy projects in India found that 54% of them would have happened anyway without CDM finance. So what is actually happening is that 54% of these projects are being calculated to allow 54% of increased emissions. That's like running a coal plant for 5 years. That's what it has been. And there are thousands of these projects. So they don't reduce emissions. At this COP, they want to expand the framework of carbon markets so that they can bring in so-called emissions avoidance through REDD+ projects. So REDD+ is the reducing emissions from forest degradation and deforestation, which has been plagued with huge problems and conflicts, which is why it is not at the moment included under the UNFCCC carbon markets process. Huge amounts of indigenous peoples' conflicts, violence, land grabbing, lock and chain protected areas, lack of actual emissions reductions, but here they want to bring it in. Then the new game in town is so-called carbon removals, which is not just avoiding and reducing emissions, which certainly don't have any emissions reductions promises, but now they are saying that we're actually going to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground, and that has to be, of course, counted as an emissions reductions because we're actually doing that. But what do they mean when they say emissions removals? What they mean is large-scale, planetary-scale geoengineering projects. So things like solar radiation, ocean fertilization, which don't exist. They are extremely risky. They're extremely energy intensive to run. Things like carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is essentially burning trees, using the bioenergy for fuel, and then claiming that you can then store the carbon that you're burning underground forever. This is the level of craziness with which they mean when they talk about carbon removals. When they say land-based removals, they are basically saying that they want to take over 3 billion hectares, 4 billion hectares probably of the global land surface of the earth for their carbon offset projects. So the scale of land grabbing, the scale of dispossession, the scale of climate injustice that we're going to see with these type of carbon offsets through removals, through emissions avoidance, are something that we should all be extremely, extremely worried about. And here as well, they were rebranding all these, everything that I talked about together, as nature-based solutions. So all the offsets, all the emissions removals and reductions from trees, from nature, from oceans, from indigenous peoples' lands, from small-scale food production lands, from soil carbon, are being branded under these fluffy projects called nature-based solutions. But what they are is something completely different. So just to then sum up on, the problems that we see, obviously with carbon markets, they don't reduce emissions. They will push us over the 1.5 degree guardrail. We have 500 gigatons left for that, which is US emissions for 1 year. So as of next year, the US will be using other countries' fair shares of emissions. And on top of that, using carbon offsets to take over their land. They contravene justice. They are completely not a climate justice position. They continue the colonial mentality that developed countries have had historically, which claim that they can take over lands in the global south for their projects, but as well now for these offset projects. They will create a huge mega land grab. There's a famous example of just Shell, which will need an area the size of Brazil to plant. They say it, want to plant trees on an area the size of Brazil to offset their emissions. And that's one company, and we have thousands of companies with these commitments. They put the responsibility, and not just responsibility, but more impacts on communities on the ground that have had the least responsibility for the climate crisis. So what we see happening, for example, in Mozambique, is that there's the biggest gas oil field off the coast of Cabo Delgado, which is very famous for its insurgency, huge amounts of violence, 1 million people displaced. And Eni, at the same time, is funding another land grab to offset its emissions through tree planting across Africa. So it's a double land grab for what the corporations are actually doing through carbon offsets. So what do we actually want to see? What we want to see here, what we all need to be asking for here, no matter what, where we are coming from, is new additional climate finance, not in the form of loans, in line with responsibility from the developed world, actual emissions reductions in line with their fair share of what they need to be doing. We need to see the developed country governments urgently begin phase out of fossil fuel production with equity at the core. We need to transform our our energy system based on energy sovereignty, energy democracy, community-based renewable energy for those people who first need it. Our comrades have talked about the 600 million people in Africa without access to electricity. They are the ones who need it, not the ones for, our high consumption. And then we demand that the rights and sovereignty of indigenous people, of peasants, people in rural areas, women, has to be upheld. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and People in Other Rural Areas, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and support for peasant agroecology, artisanal fishing, small-scale food production, which my colleagues will talk about a lot more, I think. So yeah, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kirtana. So the next two speakers are looking more at agroecology, and we have Million Belay, who's the General Coordinator for the Africa Food Sovereignty Alliance, and then we'll be queuing up Colin Anderson, who is joining us. He's one of the reasons we moved, so joining us from the University of Vermont, where a new center on agroecology has been established. And Colin will be looking at finance for agroecology. So Million, to you first.
Thank you very much. Welcome, after all the confusions. I will speak in the context of my continent, Africa. As you know, everybody has a solution for Africa, more than any other continent. But what's the solution for us, and why have we decided on this direction, on this path, in the context of the climate crisis that we are facing? That's a very much important question for us. We are, as the rest of the world, in a crisis, in a food-related crisis, malnutrition, and hunger, and the rise in non-communicable diseases, environmental crisis, the major one being now climate crisis, cultural crisis. I think the cultural crisis part is very much important for us because in times of COVID, for example, it's our own food, culturally important food, which has helped us to survive. So that is very much important. So going forward in the context of the climate crisis, what is the future? I think there is a part of the international body in association on relationship with our government, which is pushing our agriculture in a different direction, basically industrial agriculture direction or conventional form of agriculture. Their narrative is that climate change is a crisis, African land is degraded, people's knowledge of food production is very low. The usage of agrochemical in Africa is very low. That's why Africa is not producing more food. Africa's agriculture should be reoriented to market. And based on that, they frame the climate crisis as a crisis of food shortage. So what they are recommending is increase in productivity. And this has a historical reason, If you wear a political economy lens and look at the challenge that we are having, you don't see only technical or efficiency-related or technological solutions as a solutions. But historically, I think from the first arrival of the European ships, and colonialism and post-independence and whatever, we see a continuous reorientation of our agriculture into market-based agriculture, especially to save the outside world. So our agriculture are on ground and also in our mentality is hugely disrupted. So this kind of disruption requires resistance, and the social movement has to rise up and resist. And for us, our forms of resistance, in addition to also our forms of adaptation, is what we call agroecology. Ecology is very much important because it builds resilience into a system. Cyclone Ida, for example, in Zimbabwe, it has killed more than 100 people, and there was flooding, there was landslides, and there was a research done after that, and they found out that those farmers who are farming agroecologically are much more together socially, and the land is also much better. And the research from the IPES Food, International Panel of Experts on Sustainability of Food, confirms that in Cuba, farmers have shown to suffer 50 to 60% less of crop damage, after some of the crisis. So resilience, agroecology builds resilience into our food system, and it's important for that. And we have shown through examples, through research, that it increases productivity. If people are worried about increasing productivity, agroecology increases productivity. We have shown that in Ethiopia too. There was a comparison of 5 crops, and there was a plot of land that was treated with artificial fertilizer, another plot was left as a control, and another plot was treated with organic fertilizers. And across 5 crops, barley, wheat, beans, which are important, and F in another crop, we could see that land treated through agroecologically method did much better than fertilizer. Well, for the first 2-3 years, yes, productivity increases, but agroecological lands would catch up quite slowly. So in terms of productivity, it's very, very much important. I think in terms of climate crisis, nutrition and health are very much important. So the diverse food that you grow in your farm are much more nutritious. So that's also a very important factor. In terms of income also, it increases income in the family. Now we are supporting agroecological entrepreneurs from all over Africa, and these entrepreneurs have proven that there is an increasing demand in Africa for healthy food, because the health crisis in Africa is huge. It's really bad. In some countries, almost half of the population is already obese or overweight. So this is as a continuous crisis, and nutrition is important, and agroecology builds nutrition into a system. And it's important for the environment also, It sequesters carbon. You don't have to go through all the systems that Gitana was talking about. Through agroecology, actually, you can sequester carbon. But you don't do agroecology to sequester carbon. You do agroecology because it's very much important for the farmers. It's much important for the people in general. For the health of the people and the health of the environment. Carbon sequestration can be an additional result of the whole process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Million. I think that is a crucial way around. The carbon sequestration can come as a benefit of farming a better way, but we're looking for a bigger vision. I'm hoping now that we can join Colin. Yeah. Okay, we're ready for Colin anytime.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Welcome.
I can also hear myself back into the microphone. So now, I was trying to share my screen. I can see here that I'm not able to because this is only meeting organizers can share. Can somebody give me sharing rights?
I don't know if they hear you. Colin is asking, can you give him permission to share screen? Colin, I introduced you simply as part of the University of Vermont's new Agroecology Center. I don't know what you heard, and that you would be talking about finance for agroecology. So I hope that was the right setup.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. I can't see who's all in the room, but I can see the my colleagues at the front. Mm-hmm.
The camera goes to whoever's speaking, so unfortunately we don't have any control.
No, it's all right. I'm just I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be in the room. But I see it's pointing at empty chairs. Oh, it's pointed at me now on the screen. Okay. But thanks for having me. Again, I have some slides here to share, which are, I think, helpful in the context of what I'm going to present, but I can get started without them them there's a way to turn them on. IT doesn't know who started the call, apparently.
No, they're here in the room with us, but I think it's all new to everyone to be using the technology. We're looking at all the chat go by as well.
Okay.
I think you should start, Colin. We've already, as you know, delayed quite along.
Sure, no problem. So my name's Colin. I'm from the the Institute for Agroecology at the University of Vermont. I'm going to talk a bit. Oh, I can share my screen. Wonderful. I'm getting messages from the IT team. Can you see that?
We can. You're sharing a screen now, so
Perfect.
That's great. But so for now, a blank. Yep. But you're sharing.
Okay, so I'm going to discuss a little bit about our work on looking at financing agroecology and agroecology transitions more generally. And it builds on some of the things that have been said today and focuses in on public financing for agricultural and food systems development. There was a recent report that came out that showed how food systems are really underrepresented in financing for food systems change for climate finance. So while food systems are responsible for 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, they only receive 3% of climate financing. And that's only part of the story, because the funding that does go towards food systems transformation, we also need to interrogate what that looks like. There's been lots of recent work done, and Milian laid out the case for agroecology, and it seems clear. Oh, 1 second. It's clear that agroecology is being proposed and adopted as a viable solution and an alternative paradigm for food systems change. And so agroecology has been articulated in lots of different ways. Some of the ways that are helpful, they're not the only ways, is that it's the application and the articulation of food systems through the lens of principles that reflect ecological, social, economic, and political change, and centers designing not just farms, but entire food systems based on these principles. And so we're curious, and we look at what we've been looking at is how we can enable transitions from food systems as they are now, which largely reflect the opposite of these principles at a global scale and in different places, towards ones that reflect agroecology principles. But agroecology is much more than just a set of technical practices, but it's a paradigm shift. It's based on these principles that, again, have political, ecological, and social processes and systems thinking, and is beyond the technical changes that are often emphasized and that miss a lot of the kind of what's at the heart of agroecology. It centers the agencies of farmers, the organizations and networks, and focuses on bottom-up processes. It's paired up with its twin of food sovereignty, which again focuses on the agency of people to make decisions about their food policies, practices. And top-down market-led technology-led development and financing really undermines agroecology. There's one way that people think about trying to articulate what agroecology and agroecology transformations look like is using this framework that Steve Gleesman developed. And this is a framework that's been used to evaluate funding portfolios in different contexts. And so here, I'll quickly explain so that it goes from level 0, which is absolutely no agroecology integration into programs and projects, towards level 5, which is looking at change that's deeply transformative. Levels 1, for example, focuses on increasing efficiency of existing systems, and this is obviously an important concern to conventional agriculture, but contributes very little towards agroecology transformation. Level 2 is about substituting alternative inputs into industrial conventional practices, but yes?
We've got your presentation mode, so already it's not a huge screen, but are you able to switch to display rather than presentation? That will make it bigger for us. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I think
a
second.
That's already...
Is that better?
It's already a little bit better. I think we got rid of one thing, not both things. But carry on. It just, yeah, now we've got more than one thing on the screen and we can't see, but there's a little better. And also, there are bigger screens behind you, so some people, you might want to actually look at the screen over your shoulder because it's a bigger display. Sorry, Colin,
sure.
Please carry
Hopefully
on.
That's better. I can't see my notes, but I'll rough it, so thanks. And so level 3 is focusing on redesigning farming and food systems based on the principles of agroecology, so it's a fundamental shift. Level 4 thinks about the relationships between rural people and farmers and food producers and consumers and civil society, developing alternative food networks. And level 5 is this rebuilding the global food system, focusing on power, control, governance, and policies and cultural changes that are needed to allow us to redesign food and farming systems. And so it's these levels 3 to 5 that are really important when we're thinking about actually enabling agroecology transformation in places. So there's been all of this work done that's trying to evaluate just different funding portfolios and how they do or do not support agroecology transformations. And most of the work has really shown how little money, there's a very small amount of money that goes towards food systems transformation generally. What is there largely is oriented towards those levels 1 and 2, which is supporting the conventional industrial food system to tweak and to adjust to become more efficient and to substitute inputs. And there's very little focus on these broader changes that are needed. So this work has been done looking at development aid in different European countries, showing Switzerland, in the evaluation coming out as an outlier, but most of the support doesn't go towards agroecology. There's been work done by BioVision and IPES Food that shows just how little goes towards in agricultural development in Kenya, less than, you can see here that less than that 80% to 100% of funding goes away from agroecology towards other approaches. The work done by my colleague Nina Moeller and CSA, looking at the total investment per category of these different levels of supporting agroecological change towards the EU flows of money through FAO, EFAD, and WFP, that almost none goes towards agroecology and only some of it partially supports agroecology. Again, here we're looking at the total amount of funds in the GCF agricultural projects, that less than 10% goes towards, or around 10% goes to projects that support those levels 3, 4, and 5 of agroecology. 10% partially support, but that 80% of these funds are going towards supporting the status quo. Again, this is only a small proportion of overall support and funding that goes towards climate and other kinds of agricultural support for change. So the question becomes, what would it then, we know that there's very little that goes towards agroecology. We know that there needs to be more that is aimed in that direction, but what does that even look like? What does it look like to support agroecological transformations? And our other side of our work has been trying to identify what is needed to make agroecological transformations happen in place. So the first thing to say is that what we really need to do is defund industrial agriculture, and this has been clearly, the case has been made already in this panel, that we can't, funding for agroecology is very important, but the biggest barrier to agroecology is the dominance of support, not just through financing for climate financing or financing for agricultural development, but generally to defund industrial agriculture. And so there's a quote from one of the people we talked to in this research that says, we can't just keep funding African civil society organizations to be fighting this Goliath in our backyard. We need to do our part and erode the influence of some actors that are having in Africa and elsewhere. So it's super important to keep in mind that we can't be naive that supporting agroecology through climate financing projects is going to be the solution if we don't address the Goliath in the room. What gets funded is really important. So when we're looking at any funding portfolio towards agricultural and food systems development, that agroecology as the solution needs to be an explicit target of funding. This can mean that we can take the elements, principles, values to guide decisions on what gets funded. So the agroecology principles that have been articulated in different ways. We need to move beyond a shallow agroecology, so to move towards levels 3, 4, and 5. And we need to think about transforming not just farming practices, but the wider enabling environment. So this means that financing needs to transform, help farmers find ways to help them transform on-farm practices through redesigning their food and farming systems based on agroecological principles, but also thinking about that enabling environment around it. How can we transform research, extension, innovation systems so that they don't continue to be an extension of corporate industrial agriculture, but allow for the knowledge of farmers, indigenous people to be combined in transdisciplinary participatory ways to advance agroecology in place? How can we adopt markets and systems of exchange and have financing and funding support systems of exchange for territorial food markets, solidarity economy, and other approaches to exchange that allow farmers to engage with urban people and consumers, but also to have access to seeds and other kinds of inputs that allow and enable agroecology to develop. How can we invest in the networks of civil society and farmer organizations and social movements to enable the culture and the enabling networks that allow for the development of and the exchange of knowledge and markets and so forth. How can we invest in projects and programs that center equity so that when we're advancing agroecology transformations, it's not just for a generally advancing them, but we think about centering women and youth and people from marginalized positions in these programs. Otherwise, we risk exacerbating the inequalities that exist in places. How can we change discourses? How can we invest in ways that don't perpetuate this focus on feeding the world and increasing productivity? Because we know agroecology can do that, but how can we center discourses that allow us to to advance rights and food sovereignty and justice in our work. And of course, we need to ensure the rights to land, seeds, water, and biodiversity, and funding that doesn't address this key critical issue in territories will never advance in agroecology. And so when we look at how agricultural development and financial aid towards agroecology and food systems transformation in place, these are critical factors. It's not just focusing on practices, but this wider arena. And critical in that is centering food sovereignty, governance, and decision-making. So funding needs to include long-term multi-phase support for agroecology in territories. It needs to be appropriately sized and flexible because a lot of funding is so inaccessible to small networks and the protagonists of agroecology in places that there needs to be a complete rethink about how funding is delivered. This needs to center the agency and protagonism of farmers, farmer organizations, and civil society networks in dialogue with affected people for the decision-making on investments. Part of the problem with why investments are the way they are is because of who makes decisions on them. And again, I'm almost done, just finishing. We need to ensure that we build the agency and the decision-making capacities of people into how investments are made. And finally, of course, this issue of governance, policy, and food sovereignty is key because public financing for agroecology is only one part of the story. And we can't, again, be naive that we're going to be able to shift all of these public financing options and programs and philanthropic support because a lot of the levers, the people that have their hands on the levers of change for these programs are not easily going to be convinced and it's rooted in the existing paradigm. Thank you.
Colin, thank you so much. I know we went through a lot to get the technology, but personally, I think it was worth it. It was really very clear and probably a bit frustrating for you not to see us, but we could hear you and see you, and the slides were great, so thanks.
Thanks.
So we have two more speakers. I'm proposing that we may run over about 10 or 15 minutes. I know some people may have to go, but I think that's what we should do. So these last two are brought in more to start a discussion. The first, Ubre Joe from Friends of the Earth in Africa, from Nigeria, the Climate Justice and Energy Coordinator for Friends of the Earth in Africa. And finally, Jasmine Rocco Predasi, who's the Climate Policy Coordinator for an Argentine organization called FARN, which in English is the Environment and Natural Resources Foundation. And she's also the co-chair of the Climate Action Network's Agriculture Working Group. So I'll give you both the floor for a few minutes each, and then we'll open up for some conversation and discussion.
Okay.
Can you turn yours off?
Okay. So I will just want to give a few examples and the impact of some of the 4 solutions that have been implemented in Africa. Yeah, I want to start. Of course, we've all read and get to know the story of the GM cotton in Burkina Faso. In Burkina Faso, for 8 years, when the farmers there had crisis with pest infestation on their cotton, the government actually sought external help, and Monsanto at that time came to their rescue. And coming to their rescue was not the best thing that actually happened to them, but was kind of it turned out to be worse decision that the government has ever made as at that time. So for 8 years, the farmers, they abandoned their local varieties and they turned to the Monsanto GM cotton called the Bogard 2 cotton. And for that 8 years, what the farmers recorded, the Monsanto cotton were below the normal quality that the local variety was given to the farmers. Within that period, that they planted Monsanto cottons, at the same time, their local varieties were displaced. There was a huge economic loss on the part of the farmers, the government, and even textile industries, because the cotton that were coming out, they were of very poor quality. And after 8 years, I believe Monsanto ran away, and the farmers also abandoned the Monsanto seed. It interests you to know that Monsanto tried to cover up their chain. They came up with the fallacy to say that they were overtaxed. That is why they had to abandon that project in Burkina Faso. So with the discussion around agroecology, if the government had invested that resources that they invested in bringing Monsanto GM cotton into Burkina Faso to disrupt the local varieties that had been giving the country good produce all these years, I believe it would have been a better story. So I think the awareness of agroecology is still something that we need to still spread. Another example that I want to also give is the story of Red Plus in Nigeria and some other part of Africa. You know, Red Plus, like what my colleague explained, I see no reason why the world leaders and industries will want to find a shortcut. Instead of reducing their emission at a source, they are trying to see how they can trade emission to cover up and continue to pollute and then continue to make more profit. When Nigeria government accepted Red Plus programs, then our communities that have preserved these forests were exposed to crisis. Now, Cross River State has one of the unthreatened forests in that time before the Red Plus program was adopted. The moment the government signed on to the Red Plus program, government of Cross River State, where the project was implemented, they immediately mobilized forest guard to those community forests. And those communities, they depend on those forests they had preserved for years as a source of livelihood, a source of survival. Most of the streams where they collect their water from, they are right inside, they cut across those forests. And when this RED program was adopted, the forest was locked up. That means that period, farmers were being arrested for even plucking a leaf from that forest. So that's was the danger of the RED program in Nigeria. Government made a lot of money from it at the early stage. I think they got about $7.6 million. But the shocking thing is that even the government that adopted this RED program and also used it to displace their community, people that had taken care of the forest for thousands of years, the governor that signed onto this project when he was leaving office, he made a statement that from his assessment, the RED project has become very unproductive to the state. That means the money that they got for the program, the state spent more money, more than what they received, which means the RED program was kind of unproductive to the state. And he was regretting that because he lost in terms of the monetary value that was placed on the program. But he was never bothered about the impact of the project on the community people that had to lose their source of livelihood. So, RED program failed in Nigeria. Now, we are no longer hearing the mention of RED in the climate discourse is no longer visible. They are now coming with the different slogans, carbon capture, carbon storage, and all that. But these are the same mechanisms which will also fail. These are the same mechanisms that will also impact on the local community negatively. So we have to shun any form of forced solution and adopt community forest management, which I believe is the way out of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that reminder that this is familiar territory, not some new idea just invented. Hasmin.
Okay, thank you, and welcome everybody. We're almost done with the panel, but just I wanted to share some thoughts around Coronivia, the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, because we've been discussing so far what we do not want, what we do want, but maybe it's important to link it back to where we are, right? We're at COP27, and in this space, and for some years now, there has been a particular agenda item to discuss agriculture, and that is like something very important in itself, because there are no sectoral conversations within the UNFCCC. So that has been a win, let's say, at least to have that space. And this Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, and it's called Joint Work because it's both under the SBA and the SABSTA, was created at COP23. And so since then, we've been having this kind of workshop dynamic in which we discuss different topics such as soil health, livestock, socioeconomic dimensions, and so on. And we are approaching the end of the line, let's say, for Coronivia, or at least for this first phase of Coronivia. And I think that is the conversation that we should be having, like what has been happening and what needs to happen from now on. What has been happening, like I said, we've been having these workshops, we've had conclusions from the workshops, now the overall conclusions of all of the workshops are being negotiated as we speak. And in all of that time, CAN in particular has been, but many other organizations as well, have been fighting to try to have agroecology in that space, and not just to be discussed in the workshops, but to actually be incorporated in the text. We nearly got there at COP26. We had a text in brackets with the mention of agroecology. Unfortunately, this year in the SPs, we kind of lost that fight. But we also had several risks, let's say, during this process. Like, we've been advocating for agroecology, but there had been, of course, other stakeholders who have been advocating for other things that we do not like so much. And so we've also had the risk of that space turning into a space in which climate smart agriculture is discussed, tech solutions, and also diluting messages. So we didn't want agroecology to be one of the many solutions for agriculture in climate change. So the outcome so far has not been as great as we have wanted, but it hasn't been, in terms of the results and the conclusions that we've had, it hasn't been as bad as it could have been either, which is an overall not so bad balance, let's say. But now we're looking into the future, and we have to produce a new mandate with a new roadmap for Coronivia, and I think that's so important because we need to have this discussion on what is Coronivia going to do in the future, and what topics it's going to have, and what kind of objective this space is going to have. And for example, things that we have been discussing is we need to have like not just a recognition of agroecology in a COP decision as the solution to most of the problems that we've been raising in agriculture, but also we need a coordination between UN bodies. It's not possible that we're discussing agriculture in Coronivia and we're discussing agriculture, for example, in the CFS, and the spaces are not talking to each other, and parties, like countries, are saying different things in different spaces, and that is just, it doesn't make any sense. And of course, we also would like to see more tangible outcomes from Coronivia, because that's not what we've had so far. But I'll stop there, maybe just to give that overall view on Coronivia, and of course, if there are any questions, I can go a little bit more on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. And I think, well, certainly from IATP's point of view, we're very interested in that last question about how do we bridge some of these different spaces where agroecology, carbon markets, different kinds of false solutions are being discussed. And, you know, instead of putting out lots of different fires at different times, you know, how can we kind of build on what we've got? But there may be other questions as well. And I would just open the floor, and I think you just need to raise your hand high, and I'll point, and the mic's in front of you. But maybe when you speak, also just say briefly your name and where you're coming from today. Robbie.
Hi there, I'm Robbie from IPES Food. I'm just wondering to what extent you see that there's a danger that agroecology could be co-opted into the carbon markets, the carbon farming process. It seems that there's so much money, unfortunately, so much momentum behind that. Agroecology, as we've heard, is kind of relying on small bits of funding from philanthropists. We're asking for bits of funding from climate finance, but it pales in comparison to the billions that are there in the carbon markets now. So to what extent do you see that that's a threat for agroecology, potentially agroecology getting co-opted in the way that we've seen other concepts being co-opted, and what could be some of the strategies to avoid that?
I'm happy to come in here. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think the question of how agriculture is dealt with in the UNFCCC is a really important question. Oh, sorry. We've seen when forests came into the COP, and the result has been what my colleague here to the right of me has talked about, which is, you know, REDD+. And there is a real threat that if agriculture is taken on in a meaningful way here, it's going to be about emissions intensity, it's going to be about offsets. And so we, both groups that are engaging in the inside and those that are, you know, concerned and feeling the impacts on the outside, really have to have a coherent position on what it is that we want these bodies to be discussing. What is the mandate of these bodies? What's the outcome that we want? Very clearly. And it needs to be coherent with what movements and what civil society groups that are really engaged in the food system are asking for in the civil society mechanism of the Committee on the World Food Security. And I think there's also not a deep understanding amongst everybody who's involved in the food system about what's at stake right now and how many fronts. So I think it's not just folks engaged in this space understanding, but folks understanding in other spaces what the challenges are. We can be asking for agroecology for food sovereignty in a lot of spaces, but where's the rubber hitting the road? And the rubber hitting the road is really this whole notion of removals, net zero, race to net zero. It's happening in such a massive way. And, you know, even today, there are colleagues in another totally different track in this space fighting against a 3-page text that is saying every removal should be included as part of mitigation. You know, that's the Article 6.4 negotiation. If there was, you know, if I could say that everyone should be working on one thing, it would be that. It would be, we need to stop a completely broad definition of removals. Oceans, land, everything should be allowed under mitigation at the UNFCCC. I mean, if we let that in, it's like the biggest loophole that this conference is going to leave with, you know, and it's a very serious challenge that we all have to really own. I'll stop there, sorry.
Yeah, maybe just quickly to add, yeah, I think I see that happening already. For those of us who were following the UN Food Systems Summit process in 2021, there was very clear that their overall framing was on nature-based solutions for food. And agroecology was one of the ways in which, and the biggest focus, if you actually trawl through the documents, which sadly I had to do, the biggest focus is soil carbon markets. That's where all the funding, all the proposals were around soil carbon markets. So that's a very particular threat. I think framing agroecology as soil carbon sequestration is something that we see happening. The European Union has its huge program at the moment to develop the certification mechanisms and measurement mechanisms for soil carbon. So that is I think it's a very serious threat. And I think we need to fight it on all counts. I think it's very important that the movements understand each other, that the level of threat. What we can see happening, for example, in the UK, I've spoken to organizations who do soil carbon measurement, and they say that a lot of the farmers they work with are not even aware that actually what they are generating is a carbon credit that the government is going to sell. So they are doing soil carbon sequestration. They don't even know. And they don't know, for example, that once they sell it, they cannot claim to be sustainable anymore. They've sold the rights to that carbon to somebody else. So that's one thing. So that's one threat. The other threat, of course, is that actually if agroecology becomes contaminated, let's say, and the truth is that we're desperate for funding, right? And all the big funding is going to come via the carbon markets. And then at the local level, people will not necessarily know where the funding is coming from. It could start off being public funding, as it is now in the European Union, with the view that in 5 years it will develop into a carbon market. Because, of course, you need public funding to create a market, right? The market has to be regulated. People have to have faith in it. So they will spend 5 years doing that and then enter it into a carbon market. The other danger I see is that actually, although the funding will be there, in the end it will be for big farms, because realistically speaking, nobody has the time or energy or money to actually generate soil carbon from small-scale food producers. That's never going to happen. It will probably be tree plantations. That's the easiest, first, biggest one, which will then grab land. And second is big farms who can actually access payments, who can access the measurement costs, all this kind of stuff. So I think there's a whole series of barriers. But I think for me, I feel like more than the official spaces of the UNFCCC and CFS and linking up, I think those of us, the movements who are working in those spaces, really need to be talking to each other to understand, what is actually happening when these things are happening on the ground. So that's, yeah.
Can I just, quickly ask there, add one thing, because you mentioned carbon credits between countries and individuals. But for example, what I'm seeing in Argentina is it's much more linked to private companies doing business directly with agricultures. And that is a big problem because we don't know what they're actually doing, how the practices that they're taking place, how that's going to impact in the long term. So I think that the voluntary market is a very big risk.
Nice bridge with what we do. My name is Nera van der Geest. We work for Cordate, one of the partners, and we work with the voluntary carbon market, I have to admit, to bring money to low-income households. So we are using carbon markets to implement projects in a local scale. So what I would love to add to this discussion, there is a lot of threat in these markets, but it is all about the way how you do it. And we are very strong on looking at where the funds go, so to secure that the financial flows are going to the communities. And we're very much looking at the ownership of the carbon credits. I mean, we work mainly in the clean cooking space, not in the nature-based solution area at this moment. We implement clean cooking projects in many countries in which we consider the household to be the owner of the credit. And I know all the discussion we've been in this space like 2009. It's very interesting that there is so much criticism because that will improve the market. I've attended several meetings on financial transparency, and I think if you see the carbon markets as something that will not vanish on the short term, you should really promote a very high transparency in financial flows. And that is what we use, the Fair Trade Climate Standard, which is a standard on which we will have a side event tomorrow, Q2-5. And in that we say we also invest part of the income of the carbon to agriculture and to biodiversity conservation. So I just want to add a different scope. I mean, I feel we're doubting the system every day, but we still have, well, we will change our policy as well, but until now we have always been using the carbon markets to fund projects. And what I see in one of the projects where we work in Burkina Faso, all the partners had to stop their work because the donor funding stopped. And we were the ones that could continue to work with the communities because we could sell the carbon credits for a very high price to benefit the project. And if you have partners in between that work on behalf of the local communities, I think there is a room for good carbon projects. And I know all the nitty-gritty things that can go wrong, but I just want to add this to your scope. I mean, one of the partners of CITSE is doing this with the best intention to bring this as a fair and inclusive carbon market. So we try to do it as good as we can. So it's good to know that we're here, and I'm happy to engage in questions on how and what and when, but just to shed another light on carbon markets. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Rita Owaka from Nigeria, Friends of the Earth Africa. I just want to join voices with my colleagues here, Katana and Obrejo, that the carbon market is a serious threat to the local food system and agroecology, especially in Africa, where there are a lot of peasant farmers, family farmers that depend on land for survival. And we're seeing the biggest threat to agroecology in the continent to the expansion of agro-commodities, by different transnational companies that come in the name of development. Lands are taken away, forests are cut down just to promote agro-commodities. And this is a serious threat to agroecology. A lot of impoverishment, that is being seen by, financial institutions, by government as a development opportunity. And we think that the use of carbon credits, which agro-commodities companies are now claiming carbon credits on expanding agro-commodities in different community territories, is a false solution that we need to denounce. Because now we are seeing different initiatives, brainwashed ideas that plantations are forests, and that plantations is a solution to the food crisis, to the biodiversity crisis, and all those blah, blah, blah narratives that does not add value to the solutions that we are professing here. So we know that it does not in any way contribute to the growth of the local food system. Instead, there are social, environmental, and gender impacts. And these contribute immensely to climate crisis, biodiversity care crisis that we have in front of us. So we cannot continue to promote carbon credit. We do not support it. We do not support the idea of industrial plantation expansion, which is a major threat to agroecological practices on the ground.
Thank you so much. My name is Muketoi. I'm from Zambia. I work for Pelham Zambia, and I'm here with AFSA. My question is around financing of agroecology. Currently, in my country, for instance, this year they're spending over $300 million on fertilizers, which is way above 50% of the national agriculture budget. And as civil society, we are also currently having a series of meetings with the government to see if we can develop a national strategy on agroecology. And financing is a big component of that. And we're trying to see how best we can convince government to actually adopt this strategy and actually allocate resources to agroecology strategy that we are developing. So how do we best engage and, push this agenda and influence this financing to agroecology? Because currently, all the money is going to industrial farming, more especially on fertilizers and hybrid seed. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think it brings me back to what Robbie was asking about, really, which is I think we can't be frightened to use agroecology. We just have to use it in a lot of spaces and places, because I think it has in all the principles around agency, around a comprehensive view of a diverse food system with a diversity of actors, shared risks, shared benefits, that we just can't afford to be too scared to go out there and talk about it, I feel. I think that it's really important. And as I listen to the different threats here, I think it is important to have a space inside the UNFCCC where the conversation happens, at least, because this forum isn't listening to other forums. We have a bigger question on how we can better consolidate our work, though, and how we can strengthen what we're doing at the UN Committee on World Food Security and bring that out. So I think there's probably a both and rather than an either or strategy. But maybe as a last question to anyone on the panel who wants to think about it, I mean, where do you see the best space in the multilateral system to be defining what we want from agroecology, and sort of why? And if it's, I don't think that best space is here, but I do think we need an outlet for agroecology in the UNFCCC. But where would you want to see it? And then how would you overcome any of the disadvantages of the favorite space?
Probably the best space is where agriculture is already being discussed in KJWA. I think. I think agriculture is being discussed now at KJWA. I think probably it's very much important that at least, realistically we should expect that should be considered as one of the points to be discussed in the future, the future negotiation process. And also in adaptation, in terms of adaptation, I think in all adaptation discussions, agroecology should feature as a best solution for adaptation for farmers. I think that's very much important. And in the finance also, I think new finance, accessible finance, predictable finance should be there for agroecology. So in the finance arena also there should be a discussion. I can't tell you where specifically, but it should feature. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question of what we want is already there. I think that we don't need, that's our space to define it, and we obviously have that. As you all know very well, we had the Nyeleni process on agroecology, which is very clear about what the framework for agroecology is within food sovereignty. So I think that is our space in AFSA and in all our movements, in Friends of the Earth and all of our comrades here. In terms of the multilateral spaces, I think we're in a difficult moment, obviously, that we're just coming out of a long period of, we're not coming out, actually, sorry. We're still in a very long period where we do not have the power to actually change the multilateral system. That's true in the UNFCCC, it's true in many other spaces. Because, as we know, we can't pretend that we are not living in a situation, as we see here, as we see everywhere, of extreme far-right, neoliberal tendencies, repressive tendencies, extreme, pro-corporate governments everywhere. So we can't pretend that that's not the case, and we're just going to win things without, building our power. So I think we're still in that situation, and we have to admit that, and we have to fight on all counts. And of course, as Colin said very well, agroecology is not just about finance, it's also, a lot of it is about public policy for agriculture, right? So that's at the national level, that's at the subnational level, and that's also at the international level. So I think that's fine. And I think, of course, the discussion has to happen on many different levels, but I think that we have to be aware. I mean, the space where I work most is the UN Committee on World Food Security, which is a very progressive space. It has a mandated on the human right to food. But even there, we have seen that it is almost getting virtually impossible to get progressive outcomes on agroecology. So I think we have to be realistic. We have to be realistic about the threats. We have to be realistic about what we can achieve. But we keep fighting, and we will get there.
So I just wanted to add that the discussion on agroecology, the implementation of agroecology will be very challenging if we leave the aspect of lowering or cutting down on emission generally outside of it. So we must find a way to marry both. If not, if we pursue the concept of agroecology, which is part of adaptation mechanism that Dr. Miller just mentioned, and leave the side of mitigation, then it's going to be very frustrating for us.
I would actually take up what Million is saying and maybe have a follow-up conversation. I'm not sure the UNFCCC is really a truly participatory space for movements and for CSOs to discuss agriculture in a meaningful way. I mean, I am very inspired by Jasmine and her commitment to engage in this space because we need warriors like her to stop all the bad stuff. But for AFSA to be meaningfully involved in actually getting meaningful outcome out of agroecology, if it was even mentioned as a word in this, would be a huge challenge because like Kirtana is saying, no, the CFS is a progressive space. There's a whole process where civil society is actually able to engage in that space, even though the outcomes now are also challenging there. I think if we wanted good climate outcomes out of this space for agriculture, we would have to stop the informal informals. We would have to have much greater transparency and openness in terms of access. It wouldn't be like 500 euros a night for people to come and stay